The applause died mid-clap. Ellen DeGeneres stood frozen at center stage, her smile slowly fading as she processed what she'd just heard. In 40 years of television, she'd never stopped a show for anything. But the words that had just come from the woman sitting in the front row changed everything. I'm forgetting everything. But I'll never forget how much I loved teaching. The studio fell into complete silence. Ellen's wireless microphone trembled in her hand as she looked down at Mrs. Helen Robinson, a 65-year-old retired teacher wearing a simple floral dress and clutching a worn photo against her chest. What Ellen didn't know yet was that this moment would become the most powerful segment in daytime television history. It was Thursday afternoon at the Warner Bros. Studios in Burbank. Ellen's Teacher Appreciation Week special was being taped, the set decorated with chalkboards, apple centerpieces, and colorful classroom posters. The energy was exactly what producers expected: celebratory, warm, filled with the kind of gratitude that made educators feel valued. Mrs. Robinson had been brought by her daughter Sarah as part of a surprise segment honoring teachers who had made extraordinary impacts. Helen had taught fourth grade at Lincoln Elementary in Ohio for 40 years, touching the lives of over 3,000 students. Her classroom walls had been covered with thank you letters from former students who credited her with changing their lives. But 6 months ago, everything changed. Helen had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. The woman who had dedicated her life to helping children learn was slowly losing her own memories, one precious moment at a time. The journey to Ellen's show had been Helen's own idea, one of her final lucid requests. "I want to teach one more time," she had told Sarah during a rare moment of clarity, "while I still remember why I loved it." The show had progressed normally through its opening segments. Ellen danced through the audience with her characteristic energy, high-fiving excited teachers and education supporters. She interviewed a celebrity guest about their new children's book, creating the kind of positive atmosphere that made good television. During the teacher appreciation segment, Ellen had called several educators to the stage to share their stories. Each had received generous gifts, classroom supplies, technology upgrades, and checks to support their programs. The audience had responded with enthusiastic applause, celebrating these unsung heroes. Then Ellen noticed something that made her pause. While other honored teachers were chatting excitedly with each other, Mrs. Robinson sat quietly in the front row, staring at the photo in her hands with an expression of profound sadness. "And we have one more very special teacher here today," Ellen announced, approaching Helen's seat. "Mrs. Helen Robinson, who taught fourth grade for 40 years in Ohio. Mrs. Robinson, would you like to tell us about your teaching experience?" Helen looked up slowly, her eyes carrying a depth of emotion that caught Ellen off guard. These weren't the bright, proud eyes of a retired educator basking in recognition. These were the eyes of someone fighting a battle she couldn't win. "I taught fourth grade," Helen said softly, her voice barely audible over the wireless microphone Ellen held. "For 40 years. I remember loving every day." Something in her tone made Ellen kneel down beside Helen's seat, bringing herself to the woman's eye level. The cameras followed, but Ellen's focus was entirely on this woman, who seemed to be carrying an unbearable weight. "That's amazing, Mrs. Robinson. 40 years of shaping young minds. What was your favorite part about teaching?" Helen's eyes filled with tears. She held up the photo she'd been clutching, a faded image of her final fourth grade class, 28 smiling faces surrounding their beloved teacher. Watching them learn to read, seeing their faces light up when they finally understood something difficult, making them feel special when no one else did. The studio audience began to sense they were witnessing something beyond a typical teacher appreciation moment. Ellen glanced at Sarah, Helen's daughter, who was sitting nearby with tears already streaming down her face. "Mrs. Robinson," Ellen said gently, "you seem upset. Is everything okay?" That's when Helen said the words that would stop the show and break everyone's heart. "I have Alzheimer's," she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of the admission. "I'm forgetting everything. My students' names, their faces, the lessons I taught. 40 years of memories, and they're disappearing." The silence in the studio was deafening. Ellen felt her own eyes beginning to water as she processed what this incredible woman was sharing. Behind the scenes, producers stopped barking directions into their headsets, understanding they were witnessing something profound. But, Helen continued, her voice growing stronger, I'm forgetting everything, but I'll never forget how much I love teaching. That feeling, that joy, that's still here. She placed her hand over her heart. Even when everything else is gone, I'll remember that I loved them. Ellen's microphone slipped from her fingers, hitting the studio floor with a metallic clang. For the first time in her career, Ellen DeGeneres was completely speechless. She looked around at her audience, at her crew, at the cameras capturing this moment of raw vulnerability. Without consulting producers, without checking protocols, Ellen made a decision that would define this moment forever. She stood up and walked to center stage, addressing her entire studio. Ladies and gentlemen, Ellen announced, her voice thick with emotion, we're going to do something different today. Mrs. Robinson has spent 40 years teaching children. Today she's going to teach all of us. The audience looked confused, but Ellen was following her heart rather than any script. She walked back to Helen and extended her hand. Mrs. Robinson, would you mind coming up here and giving us one last lesson? Helen looked uncertain, glancing at her daughter for encouragement. Sarah nodded through her tears, and slowly Helen stood up and made her way to the stage, still clutching her class photo. Ellen met her at center stage and gently took her hand. Mrs. Robinson, if you could teach the world one last lesson, what would it be? Helen looked out at the audience of 300 people, then directly into the main camera. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of 4 decades spent in front of classrooms. Love what you do, really love it, because when everything else fades away, love is what remains. Ellen felt something break open inside her chest. She looked at this remarkable woman who was losing everything, but had found a way to share wisdom that transcended her illness. Mrs. Robinson, can you show us what that love looks like? Without hesitation, Helen stepped forward and began to speak as if she were addressing her 4th grade class. Good morning, children, she said, her voice transforming into the warm, encouraging tone she'd used for 40 years. Today we're going to learn about something very important. We're going to learn about courage. The studio was mesmerized. Here was a woman facing the loss of her memories, and yet she was still teaching, still giving, still loving. Ellen found herself sitting cross-legged on the stage floor, becoming Helen's student. Courage, Helen continued, isn't about not being scared. Courage is about doing the right thing, even when you are scared. It's about loving people even when it's hard. It's about getting up every day and trying your best, no matter what. Ellen looked up at Helen with tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Robinson, you're still teaching us. Even now, you're still making us better. Helen smiled, and for a moment, the fog of her illness seemed to lift. Once a teacher, always a teacher. That's what we do. We help people grow. What happened next surprised everyone in the studio. Helen walked to the chalkboard that had been set up as part of the Teacher Appreciation Week decorations. With shaking hands, she picked up a piece of chalk and began to write. Her handwriting, once pristine, was now shaky, but the message was clear. The greatest lessons come from the heart. This is what I wrote on my chalkboard every single day for 40 years, Helen explained to the captivated audience. Because math and reading and science are important, but if children don't learn to love themselves and others, nothing else matters. Ellen stood up and walked to her desk, grabbing her checkbook. She returned to Helen and knelt down beside her. Mrs. Robinson, this is for you and your family, she said, writing out a check for $75,000. For any care you need, any support, anything that helps you keep teaching the world about love. But Ellen wasn't finished. She turned to address her audience again. This woman has given 40 years of her life to educating children. She's facing something unimaginably difficult, and she's still teaching us. I want to start something new, a foundation for teachers facing health challenges, for classrooms that need support, for anyone who has dedicated their life to education. Ellen reached into her jacket and pulled out her personal business card. Mrs. Robinson, this has my direct number, she said, pressing it into Helen's hand. Because teachers like you should never face anything alone. You've spent your career taking care of others. Now it's our turn to take care of you. Helen looked at the card, then at Ellen, then at the audience that was now on its feet applauding. Thank you, she whispered. "Thank you for letting me teach one more time." As if moved by some invisible force, the entire studio audience began to recite in unison, "Good morning, Mrs. Robinson." It was spontaneous, unrehearsed, but somehow every person in that room understood that they were all Helen's students now. Ellen hugged Helen gently, feeling the fragility of this brave woman who had given so much to the world. "Mrs. Robinson, you haven't taught your last lesson. You're going to keep teaching us about courage, about love, about what really matters." As the episode concluded, Ellen addressed her audience one final time. "Today was supposed to be about appreciating teachers," she said, "and that's exactly what happened. We just learned that the most important lessons don't come from textbooks. They come from the heart of someone who has dedicated their life to helping others grow." The episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to diminish the emotional impact of Helen's story. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The show received over 200,000 messages from viewers, sharing their own stories of beloved teachers, their own experiences with Alzheimer's, their own moments when education had changed their lives. The Helen Robinson Foundation for Educators was established within 2 weeks. The foundation provides financial support for teachers facing health challenges, funds classroom supplies for underserved schools, and creates memory preservation programs for educators with dementia. Helen's daughter Sarah reported that watching the episode had given her mother a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since her diagnosis. For several weeks after, Helen seemed more like her old self, energized by the knowledge that her story was helping others. 3 months later, Helen returned to Ellen's show for a follow-up segment. Her condition had progressed, but her spirit remained strong. She brought with her a stack of letters from teachers across the country who had been helped by the foundation, each one thanking her for inspiring them to keep going. During that final appearance, Helen did something that surprised everyone. She asked Ellen to sit in a student desk that had been brought onto the stage, and she conducted one last formal lesson about kindness. Her memory faltered several times, but each time she forgot a word, she simply said, "The important thing is to love." The most poignant moment came when Helen forgot Ellen's name mid-sentence. Instead of becoming flustered, she simply smiled and said, "I may not remember your name, dear, but I remember your heart, and that's what matters most." Ellen's final words about Helen became the foundation's motto. Some people teach subjects, others teach hearts, and the greatest teachers of all teach us that love is the only lesson that truly matters. Today, the Helen Robinson Foundation has helped over 5,000 educators and transformed countless classrooms. Helen's story became a catalyst for conversations about supporting teachers not just professionally, but personally through life's challenges. Helen passed away peacefully 18 months after her first appearance on Ellen's show. At her bedside were her daughter Sarah, several former students who had traveled from across the country, and a framed photo from her final day on Ellen's show. At Helen's funeral, Ellen spoke about the day that changed everything. "Helen Robinson taught me that we're all students in the classroom of life," she said. "And the greatest teachers are those who show us that even when we're losing everything else, we never lose the capacity to love, to give, and to make a difference." The worn photo Helen had clutched that day, the image of her final fourth-grade class, now sits framed in Ellen's office. Next to it is a simple note in Helen's handwriting. "Once a teacher, always a teacher. The lesson never ends." In schools across America, teachers have adopted Helen's daily chalkboard message. The greatest lessons come from the heart. It serves as a reminder that education is not just about imparting knowledge, but about nurturing souls. Because sometimes the most powerful education happens not in a classroom, but on a television stage, where a woman facing her greatest fear chooses to teach the world about courage. And sometimes the most important lesson is that love truly is the only thing that remains when everything else fades away. 2 years after Helen's passing, something extraordinary happened that proved her final lesson had taken root. Ellen received a letter from a young teacher named Michael Torres, who had been struggling with his own early-onset dementia diagnosis at age 45. He had watched Helen's episode and decided to create memory classrooms, special programs where teachers with cognitive decline could share their wisdom in structured, supportive environments. The program had spread to over 200 schools nationwide, proving that even when memory fades, the heart of a teacher never stops giving. Perhaps the most beautiful testament to Helen's legacy came from an unexpected source: her former students. They created the Mrs. Robinson's Heart Project, where each year on the anniversary of her Ellen appearance, they visit classrooms around the world and teach Helen's final lesson about courage and love. These adults, now doctors, parents, artists, and teachers themselves, carry forward the truth Helen knew all along, that the greatest education happens when one heart touches another, and that some lessons are so powerful they echo through generations, reminding us all that love is indeed the only lesson that truly matters.